Welcome to the first lecture on evolution, where we're going to be looking at life from the first organisms onward. My name is Wendy Nofke, and I will be providing your presentation today. The Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago. Life first appeared about 4 billion years ago. The first life forms were single-celled and microscopic. At least 5 times we know that most of the Earth's living organisms have gone extinct, and extinction is when a species completely dies out and none of them remain. One model of looking at time on this planet is the Earth in a Day model. In this model, the first humans were not present until 11:59 p.m. So with this model, you start here would represent 0. As you go all the way around, over here represents a full 24 hours later. So humans are really pretty new in this. We have been here less than 1 minute of the relative time scale. So the fossil record is one way of learning about how things have occurred in the past. A fossil is just preserved remains or traces of organisms that lived in the past. And the fossil record is the record of life over 5 billion years, pieced together by analysis of the fossils. There's different types of fossils. We can have fossilized body parts or fossilized traces. Mold fossils are going to be fossilized impressions that make a negative impression of where an organism was in a substrate. With a cast fossil, it's formed from a filled-in mold. A trace fossil, or an ichthyofossil, is a fossilized nest or footprint or some other thing that the organism used. True form fossils are a fossil of the actual animal or animal part. In dating fossils, there's a couple ways we can go about this. With relative dating, we would determine which of the two fossils we're studying is older or younger. Usually when you find them in the Earth, the lower layers are laid down earlier, so it's assumed the fossils in those lower layers are older. With absolute dating, we use this to determine about how long ago the organism lived, based on the amount of carbon-14 or other radioactive elements that remain in the fossil. We can also use molecular clocks. These use DNA sequences or proteins that they encode to estimate how long it has been since the related species diverged from a common ancestor. Greater differences in the DNA are assumed to have diverged from their ancestors more distant in the past. So the more different the organisms are, it's assumed that they diverged from that common ancestor earlier in time, and so they would have more differences in the DNA. So if we look at these organisms and compare their similarity with present humans, chimpanzees have about a 98% similarity, a mouse has about 85%, chickens about 60%, and fruit flies 44%. We can look at the geological timescale. This divides the Earth's history into divisions such as eons, eras, and periods based on major changes in the geology, the climate, and the evolution of life. So you can see here we've got the eons and then the different eras within it, the periods, the epochs, and then we have events that started to happen in there. In looking at how the Earth was formed, it's thought that it began as a rotating cloud of stardust. A nearby star exploded and created a shock wave that increased the rate of spin. By increasing the rate of spin, the mass concentrated in the center and eventually became the Sun. The smaller masses formed the planets, including the Earth. Earth was originally molten, and then it gradually cooled and formed a crust. The volcanoes continued to release the gas from the molten center. Eventually, the atmosphere formed and became dense, and then formed the oceans, which set the stage for life. Our first organic molecules are also important to look at. All living things are composed of organic molecules, so it's likely the organic molecules evolved before the cells did. It's thought that lightning sparked chemical reactions in the early atmosphere to make the organic molecules. One idea also suggests that volcanoes gave the materials that were necessary for life. So which organic molecule came first, DNA or protein? DNA actually codes for the proteins, and then we need the proteins to make the DNA. So as a result, we can't really say which of those would come first. There is the RNA world hypothesis. It's thought that early life was based solely on RNA and that the DNA and proteins evolved later. One of the reasons for this theory is RNA can code instructions just like DNA, but RNAs can also carry out some chemical reactions like proteins. So RNAs are essentially able to do the job of both a protein and a DNA. When we look at the first cells, it's not known how the organic molecules developed into cells. It is speculated that a lipid membrane grew around some organic molecules. LUCA, or the last universal common ancestor, is also an important concept here. It's thought that only one cell or one group of cells eventually gave rise to all life on Earth. It probably existed about 3.5 billion years ago and was one of the earliest prokaryotic cells. And this is who we call LUCA. The earliest cells were likely heterotrophs, which means that they got their energy from other molecules. About 3 billion years ago, photosynthesis evolved, which uses sunlight to make food from carbon dioxide and water as the autotrophs do. After photosynthesis evolved, the oxygen started to accumulate in the atmosphere. This was toxic to many cells, so they died off, but it also allowed the development of cellular respiration, which is going to require the presence of oxygen. When we look at the evolution of eukaryotes, it's about 2 billion years ago. The endosymbiont theory explains the development of the eukaryotic cells. It basically states that larger cells engulfed smaller cells that were not digested, but instead these smaller cells evolved into organelles. With time, they became what's known as the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. All of these organelles actually do have their own separate DNA in them, and they are also surrounded by a double membrane, which helps to support this theory. Additional adaptations eventually happened with the eukaryotes for sexual reproduction, cell specialization, and the ability to become multicellular.